If you have been following transportation developments in Abia State recently, then you probably heard about the announcement made by the state government a few days ago. On Wednesday, June 10th, 2026, the Abia State Government announced that all motor parks operating within Umuahia should move their operations into the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal. According to the state government, the relocation was expected to take place from June 13th, 2026, and any transport company or park that failed to comply could face sanctions and fines. Now, whenever government makes a major announcement like this, especially one that affects transportation, passengers, drivers, transport companies, and even businesses around those parks, people naturally begin to ask questions. Will everybody obey? Is the terminal ready? Can it accommodate all the transport companies operating in Umuahia? And perhaps the biggest question of all, what will happen to the parks that refuse to move? Well, today is June 13th, 2026, the very day the directive takes effect. And instead of sitting down somewhere and relying on what people were saying online, I decided to visit the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal myself to see exactly what was happening on ground. And honestly, what I saw raised even more questions. The moment I got into the terminal area, it was immediately obvious that something major was happening. There were people everywhere. Vehicles were moving in and out. Passengers were walking around. Ticket counters were active. The entire environment was busy. From the outside, it looked like many transport operators had already started taking the government directive seriously. As I moved around the terminal, I noticed several transport companies already operating from inside the facility. I saw Rivers Joy. I saw the Transport Company of Anambra State. I saw Akwa Power Link. I also saw the Abia State electric buses and many more. In fact, buses were loading one after another. Some were arriving, some were preparing to depart, others were already filled with passengers and ready for the road. Looking at all this activity, one thing became very clear. A significant number of transport operators appear to have moved into the terminal. And from the perspective of government policy, that could be seen as an early sign that the relocation plan is beginning to take shape. But while observing everything that was happening around me, one particular question kept coming back into my mind. Can this terminal actually contain all the motor parks operating in Umuahia? Now, according to information released by the state government, the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal can accommodate up to 300 vehicles. On paper, that sounds impressive. 300 vehicles is a large number, but sometimes there is a difference between figures on paper and what happens in real life. As I walked around the section allocated to transport operators, I noticed that the area was already heavily occupied by vehicles. There were buses parked in different positions. Some were loading, some were waiting for passengers, others were preparing for departure. And this was what caught my attention. If the area is already this busy on the very first day of implementation, what happens when every single transport operator eventually moves in? What happens during festive periods? What happens during Christmas and New Year seasons when passenger traffic is usually much higher? What happens during weekends when transport activities naturally increase? These are questions many people will probably begin asking as time goes on. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying the terminal cannot accommodate everybody. I'm simply sharing my observations from what I saw today. And based on what I observed, the discussion about space is definitely one that will continue. Another thing I noticed was something quite interesting. Despite the number of buses and transport operators present inside the terminal, passenger turnout did not seem to match the number of vehicles available. At least from what I observed, there were passengers, people were buying tickets, people were boarding buses, activities were happening, but compared to the number of buses present, the passenger volume appeared relatively low. And naturally, that raises another question. Why? Could it be that many passengers are still unaware that some transport operators have relocated to the terminal? After all, this relocation is still very new. Not everybody follows government announcements. Not everybody watches the news. Some people may simply go to the parks, they have been using for years without knowing that changes have already taken place? Or could there be another explanation? Could it be that some transport companies are still operating partially from their old locations while also maintaining presence inside the terminal? At this point, I honestly cannot give a definite answer because I was unable to interview passengers or transport operators. The environment was extremely busy. There was movement everywhere, there was noise everywhere. People were focused on their businesses. So, rather than making assumptions, it is better to simply raise the question and allow time to provide the answers. Now, after spending some time inside the terminal, I decided to move around and see what was happening outside. And this is where things became even more interesting. On my way, I passed the Rivers Joy Park. Immediately, I noticed something. The gate was locked. No loading activities, no visible operations, nothing was happening there. And from what I observed, that appears to suggest that Rivers Joy has moved its operations into the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal. But not every park told the same story. As I continued moving around, I came across another transport park where loading activities were still taking place. Passengers were still boarding, vehicles were still operating, business appeared to be continuing as usual. And once again, another important question emerged. If the government said operators who failed to move into the terminal would be fined, what happens next? Will enforcement begin immediately? Will there be inspections? Will authorities give operators additional time? Will there be warnings before sanctions? Or will government begin strict enforcement right away? At this stage, those questions remain unanswered, but they are important questions because the success of any policy often depends not just on making announcements, but also on how those announcements are implemented. One thing I can say from what I witnessed today is that the terminal was far from empty. Sometimes when government launches a new project, people expect to see empty facilities with little activity. That was not what I saw. There was movement, there were passengers, there were buses, there were transport companies, there was business activity. The terminal was alive. Whether that activity will continue to grow over the coming weeks is something we will all have to watch closely. And perhaps that is where the real story begins, because today was not really about finding all the answers. Today was about seeing what the situation looks like on the very first day of implementation. And from what I observed, some transport operators have clearly moved in. Some appear to be complying, others may still be transitioning. Some questions remain unanswered, and some challenges may still lie ahead. But one thing is certain, the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal is now becoming a major center of transportation activity in Umuahia. The bigger question now is whether it can successfully accommodate every transport operator expected to operate from there. Will the available space be enough? Will passengers fully adjust to the new arrangement? Will all operators eventually comply with the directive? And how will the government enforce compliance going forward? Those are the questions many people are asking. What do you think? Do you believe the Nnenna Oti Bus Terminal can successfully accommodate all the motor parks operating in Umuahia? Or do you think there could be challenges ahead? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this report helpful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Prime Joe Network, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future updates. Thanks for watching.